Welcome back, everyone. It is Michael here once again with Offshore Citizen, and today we're going to answer the question of what is an LLC? All right, an LLC generally refers to an entity within the US, and it should not be confused with a limited company. So it stands for limited liability company, but it should not be confused with limited company, which is common around the world. There are other places that have adopted LLC legislation. So for instance, Anguilla has LLC legislation, Nevis has LLC legislation, etc. So a bunch of places have kind of copied the US corporate form in this regard. But the really big important thing to note, we're going to get into kind of the structural differences, but is that a limited liability company, confusingly, is not the same as a limited company, all right? So these two things, what we call a limited company in Canada, in UK, etc., around the world, there's various different equivalents, and you can watch our video on that. If you subscribe to our channel and go and check things out, you can go and see that. If you go and check that out, I kind of give a brief explanation. Those are equivalent basically to a US C Corp, okay? So an LLC was created kind of to be easier to set up and maintain, a little bit more straightforward in that regard, and it does have some differences in tax treatment. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time, if you are a foreigner forming a company in the US, you will usually want to form a US LLC, okay? Not necessarily. There are a bunch of cases where, say, a C Corp might be more beneficial. The way that an LLC is treated for tax purposes, say if you're Canadian or Australian, will differ, okay? That's very important. And this has various different consequences. So, for instance, what will happen is in Canada, they treat a US LLC as a limited company, okay? So a C Corp and an LLC are the same things for Canadian tax purposes, okay? What this means is that your ability to carry forward and backward losses is limited. You run into some problems here, okay? Because from a US standpoint, it's like the money has all been paid out, right? But from a Canadian standpoint, it's like it hasn't. And so this creates a variety of different challenges. So you'll find some articles online that suggest that if you're Canadian, you probably shouldn't have a US LLC. This depends. If, for instance, the very first time that I ever got involved in international structuring, it was for investing between Canada and the US and buying real estate. And in that situation, it probably makes more sense to have a C Corp, just because of the nature of the income is clearly US source income, so you're not going to avoid that, and there's some consequences in terms of the write-offs, okay? On the flip side, if you were the owner of, say, a digital company, right, and that digital company has no US source income, right, and maybe has no Canadian source income, then it might be really beneficial. You might have a massive tax advantage by being able to use a US LLC. Okay, not necessarily, it depends, it's always case by case. Anytime that I say anything, please be aware, there is no one size fits all. Anyone who's selling you a one size fits all solution is it's nonsense, it's not true. Okay, so very, very important to realize right off the bat, that is the case. Okay, so you've got this US LLC structure, perfect. How does it work? Well, you don't have what are called shareholders in an LLC. Instead, you have members. Now, effectively, members are basically the same thing, okay? There are some slight nuanced differences, but we call them members in an LLC. We call them shareholders in a C Corp or a limited company, okay? Likewise, you have directors in a C Corp, and you'll have like a manager in an LLC. Okay, so you'll often ask, is it manager managed or is it member managed? Okay, this is like the most basic question that you'll see with respect to an LLC. There's differences in terms of some of the agreements that there are out there. Usually an LLC is quite easy to form. It's quite easy to maintain. There are some technical rules that you should be following. I'm not going to get into them when you run a C Corp that there are not when it comes to running an LLC. But an LLC does have the liability protection that a C Corp has, okay? Meaning that the members of the LLC are liable only for the amount that they contributed, not for anything else. So whatever's in there's the corporate veil. And again, you can go and you subscribe to our channel, you can go and check out our video on the corporate veil and I explain how that works, okay? The difference primarily for most people, like what they think about as mattering, is the tax treatment. All right. So a C Corp or a limited company is taxed as its own separate legal entity. It pays tax there on the profits, and then it distributes dividends. Okay. An LLC can, this is kind of confusing. There are something called check the box rules, and so an LLC can be taxed in a variety of different ways, but generally by default, it's taxed the same way that an S Corp is, meaning that the income flows through. Okay. So it's what we call that disregarded entity. All right. So the income of the company is the income of the members. Okay. So let's say that I have an LLC, I am the member, the company makes $100,000. Well, it's not like the company makes $100,000, that's separate, and we decide to do a distribution to me. It's like, no. The company's money and my money are the same in that sense. So it all goes onto my tax return. Okay. There are potentially, depending on what level you're at in terms of your tax bracket and things like this, there may be advantages to that. As foreigners, there's almost certainly an advantage, not almost certainly, there's often an advantage to that because you can avoid US tax potentially. Okay, so you can potentially, provided there's no US trade or business, provided, a variety of different factors, there may be no US tax. So that might be really beneficial if you're, say, trying to access US payment processing, US banking, you're doing some sort of an Amazon business, something like this. It may be beneficial to say, okay, great, we've got this US company. Okay, cool. We don't want to pay US tax though, because US tax, well, it's not as bad as it used to be, but it was a bit of a problem. Okay, so that's step one. If you're a local, being you're American, there may be tax consequences that are beneficial for you as well. Now, if you go and check out some of our other videos, I made a video on S Corps, and you're going to see that very often if you're an American and you're a sole operator, it's better to have an S Corp. An S Corp is taxed the same way as an LLC is by default, but there's some consequences in terms of how payroll tax work, etc. Generally speaking, it's going to save you a little bit of money to go with an S Corp. Again, there's no one size fits all. I'm not saying it specifically, but if you were examining, if you're saying, okay, I'm a foreigner and I'm going to form a US company, probably my default starting point would be to look at, okay, does an LLC fit for me? Might not, right? But it might. And then on the flip side, if I say, okay, well, I'm an American, I'm a sole trader, then I'm probably going to be starting off my research by looking at an S Corp. And if I have a whole bunch of shareholders, I'm raising capital, etc., then maybe I'm looking at C Corp. And if I'm a foreigner who has US trade or business, I'm actually doing business in the US, I may be looking at a C Corp as well. Okay, so that's kind of your general, okay, start looking here and then branch out your research from there. Again, if you have questions, reach out to us. You can comment, say, hey, listen, how do I get in touch with you? You can visit our websites, www.offshorecapitalist.com, www.offshorecitizen.net. You can always book a call with me, clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer. So check that out. And that should, we're happy to help you is the bottom line. Okay, so you have this LLC. The LLC, very easy to form, right? You can have as many members as you want, more or less. At least it's not constrained by what people would typically be concerned about. You'll have typically what's called an operating agreement. The operating agreement kind of governs how it gets run. You'll decide whether you have a single member or multiple members and whether you appoint a manager or not, this sort of thing. And yeah, this would be your default corporate form for many, many people, okay? There is also something called a series LLC, which is basically you can have multiple LLCs within LLCs for liability protection purposes. Although they have this legislation, I find it's mostly not very practical because of the fact that banks don't understand it. So, it's not really that useful. But in theory, for real estate investing, it's great, okay? So that's pretty much it. You have, it's treated this way. It's in the sense that you have the liability protection, you can have multiple members, it's fairly easy to maintain. You're going to have an operating agreement to govern how people work together, how the different members interact, etc. The taxation is typically going to be flow through, however you can opt to have that changed, and that would be your normal form. Now, why this is important from an international standpoint is because internationally, I've done some videos on this as well, there is no equivalent to an LLC in many countries, okay? So an LLC is kind of like a hybrid between a sole trader and a C Corp, okay? So that creates some issues, and you should definitely look into that if you're a foreigner who's looking at forming a company in the US, because it may not be treated the same way as you think. You can end up with something called a hybrid mismatch arrangement, okay? So that can be beneficial, can work for you, or it can also work against you. And I've got a video where I kind of go through and explain some of the nuances of this comparing partnerships. So anyway, subscribe to the channel, like it, share it with your friends. I hope this was helpful. Whatever it is that you're interested in, write to me, tell me in the comments what it is that you'd like to see, and I'm going to look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.